In the fall of 2023, a monarch butterfly was tagged with a tiny adhesive dot in Ontario, Canada. Researchers recorded its precise location and the date of tagging, and tracked its subsequent movement as it flew south over the following weeks. It crossed Lake Erie without landing or stopping at any point. It crossed Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, continuing south and west. It entered Texas following the same general corridor millions of monarchs use each fall. And it arrived at a specific cluster of oyamel fir trees in the mountains of Michoacan, Mexico. A forest this individual butterfly had never seen or approached before in its life. A forest that none of its parents or grandparents had ever seen either. A forest that its great-great-great-grandmother had departed the previous spring heading north. And this individual butterfly landed in exactly the same grove of specific trees. This is not a metaphor or a rounded approximation. The return is precise and documented. The monarch butterfly returns to the same specific trees in the same specific forest. Generation after generation, this return happens without any individual making the full round trip. No individual monarch lives long enough to complete the entire journey in both directions. Today we are talking about Danaus plexippus, the monarch butterfly, an insect that weighs half a gram and navigates across a continent, using a multi-layered compass system built entirely into the structure of its own body, and following a destination encoded not in its brain, but in its inherited genome. Let's start with the basic facts of the migration before we get to the biology. The eastern North American monarch population, the largest and most studied overwinters in Mexico, specifically in the transvolcanic belt of Michoacan and state of Mexico, a relatively small area of high-altitude oyamel fir forest between 2,400 and 3,600 meters elevation, where millions of monarchs aggregate on the trees in density so high that the branches of the trees visibly bend downward under the butterfly's collective weight. The sound of millions of wings moving together is described by observers as resembling soft rain. The pheromone scent of the aggregation can be detected before the forest itself becomes visible. The sheer visual density of the butterflies covering every surface of every tree in a grove is one of the more striking biological spectacles documented anywhere on Earth. In spring, as temperatures rise, the overwintering generation begins moving northward. They mate and lay eggs on milkweed plants along the southern migration corridor, and then they die before completing the journey all the way to Canada. The next generation hatching from those eggs continues the northward movement, and they too mate, deposit eggs on milkweed, and die before completing the journey to Canada. It typically takes 3 to 4 full butterfly generations to complete the northward journey, from the Mexican overwintering grounds to the summer breeding grounds in the northern United States and Canada. But in fall, the final summer generation dies, called the supergeneration or migratory generation, does not follow the 2 to 4 week lifespan pattern of summer monarchs. Instead of living the typical 2 to 4 weeks of a summer monarch, this final summer generation lives for approximately 8 months rather than 2 to 4 weeks. They delay sexual maturity completely through a physiological state called reproductive diapause. They undergo a physiological shift into a state called reproductive diapause, in which their reproductive system does not develop and they make no attempt to find mates. Instead, they feed extensively, accumulate fat reserves, and begin the southward flight. This single generation makes the entire return journey to Mexico, covering up to 4,500 kilometers without ever having been there before, and without any living monarch anywhere that has personally completed this journey before. The migratory generation that flew south the previous year is dead by the time these butterflies hatch. The knowledge of where to go is not transmitted from parent to offspring through behavior or observation. It exists encoded in the genome of each individual butterfly from the moment it hatches. And this is where the biology becomes genuinely difficult to fully absorb. A monarch butterfly hatching from its chrysalis in Ontario in early September has encoded in its DNA a directional program that says fly southwest, and a destination that says stop at these specific forest elevations in Michoacan. It has never flown before and has never seen the route it is about to take. It has never seen another butterfly make this flight or any portion of it. No living monarch anywhere on Earth has personally made this specific southward flight before, but the navigational program encoded in its genome runs correctly on the first attempt. Let's talk about how the Monarch navigates, because the navigation system is layered, and the layers work together in ways researchers are still working to fully understand. The primary navigation tool is a time-compensated sun compass. The first navigation layer Monarchs use is the position of the sun to determine compass direction. But the sun's position changes throughout the day as the Earth rotates. A navigator using only the sun's current position without accounting for time would consistently fly in the wrong direction as the day progressed. The Monarch compensates for this by integrating the sun's position with an internal circadian clock. The circadian clock used for this compensation is located in the antennae rather than the brain. The antennae contain photoreceptor cells that track the sun's position throughout the day and contain circadian clock mechanisms that allow the butterfly to track time of day precisely. This combination gives the Monarch a time-corrected compass reading at any point during the day. Researchers demonstrated this by disrupting Monarch circadian rhythms using light-dark cycle manipulation. Monarchs, whose internal clocks were set 6 hours off from local time, flew in predictably incorrect directions, as if the sun were in the position it would occupy 6 hours later. When the clock manipulation was reversed, the flight direction corrected back to the expected bearing. This confirmed that the time compensation mechanism is real and drives actual flight behavior, and established the antennae rather than the brain as the primary site of the circadian clock. But the time-compensated sun compass is only one layer of the Monarch's full navigation system. On cloudy days when the sun is not visible, Monarchs can still navigate correctly. They detect polarized light patterns in the sky that indicate the sun's direction, even when the sun itself is fully hidden behind cloud cover and not visible. Polarized light navigation is used by a number of insects, including bees, but the Monarch integrates polarized light information with the time-corrected sun compass, creates a system that functions under a wider range of sky conditions, delivering more reliable directional information than either system could provide independently. There is also evidence of magnetic field sensitivity as a third navigation layer. Monarchs appear to detect the Earth's magnetic field and use it as an additional directional reference. Exactly how this magnetic detection works at the cellular level in Monarchs is still under investigation. But behavioral experiments placing Monarchs in altered magnetic fields have documented consistent and predictable effects on the direction of flight, suggesting the magnetic sense is real and is contributing to navigation decisions. Some researchers believe the magnetic sense may be particularly important when both sun and polarized light information are unavailable, serving as a backup system that prevents complete navigation failure in low visibility conditions. The combination of time-compensated sun compass, polarized light detection, and magnetic sensitivity gives the Monarch a navigation system with multiple redundant inputs, each of which can provide directional information independently, and which together produce directional accuracy that no single input could achieve independently. Now let's talk about the Monarch's relationship with milkweed, because this is fundamental to everything about the Monarch's biology, and it is where the story of the Monarch intersects most directly with human activity. The Monarch is a dietary specialist in the most complete sense of that term. Its larvae feed exclusively on milkweed plants of the genus Asclepias and nothing else. Unlike many butterfly species, they cannot switch to alternative host plants if milkweed is absent. Milkweed is the sole larval food source for every monarch caterpillar, and milkweed contains cardiac glycosides, toxic compounds that the milkweed produces, as a primary chemical defense mechanism against being eaten by herbivores. Monarch caterpillars are not harmed by these glycosides and do not avoid milkweed because of them. Instead, they actively sequester these toxins throughout their body tissues as the caterpillar feeds, making caterpillars' pupae and adult butterflies toxic to most predators. The sequestered cardiac glycosides persist through metamorphosis, which means an adult monarch contains the toxins from the milkweed its caterpillar consumed. Birds that consume monarchs experience significant gastric distress and learn to avoid orange-black patterns. The monarch's distinctive orange and black coloration is warning coloration, a aposematic signal, advertising the toxicity to any predator that has learned or can learn from experience. The viceroy butterfly, a species in a completely different family, mimics this coloration closely. and receives some protection from predators that have learned to avoid monarchs, without itself containing the same toxin levels that make monarchs genuinely aversive. This is textbook Batchian mimicry, and the monarch is the model that makes it work. Now let's talk about what has happened to monarch populations, because this is where the biology intersects with a genuinely serious conservation situation. The eastern monarch population has declined by 80 to 95% over the past 30 years, depending on which measurement method is used and which specific period is examined. The overwintering aggregation in Mexico covered approximately 18 hectares of forest in the mid-1990s. In some recent years, the same aggregation covered fewer than 1 hectare. The numbers are not stable across years, they fluctuate significantly. There have been partial recoveries in favorable years, but the overall trend remains downward. But the long-term trend is clearly downward and has been for 30 years. The causes of the monarch's decline are multiple, and they interact with each other. The most significant factor is milkweed loss in the breeding range. Agricultural practices across the United States and Canada changed dramatically after the widespread adoption of herbicide-tolerant crop varieties in the 1990s and 2000s. Fields that previously contained milkweed growing among the crops became milkweed-free, as farmers could now spray herbicides across entire fields without damaging their crop plants. Milkweed that had existed in agricultural margins and within crop rows throughout the Midwest was eliminated across millions of hectares over approximately 10 to 15 years. Monarchs breed in this agricultural landscape, and their larvae require this milkweed. Losing it across millions of hectares of the primary breeding range is the primary driver of population decline, according to most researchers. The overwintering forest in Mexico faces ongoing pressure from illegal logging activity, reducing the specific oyamel fir forest type that monarchs require for winter temperature regulation. The mountains in Michoacan provide a specific combination of temperature and humidity that allows monarchs to survive winter in a state of low metabolic activity, without freezing and without exhausting their fat reserves before spring. Deforestation changes the microclimate of these forests in ways that reduce their insulating capacity, threatens the physical survival of butterflies during overwintering. Climate change is also affecting both the breeding range and the migration timing, in ways that researchers are still working to fully characterize and separate. Changes in the timing of milkweed emergence relative to when monarchs arrive in spring can create a mismatch between the butterflies and their larval food source. Drought conditions affecting milkweed availability and quality, and changing patterns of extreme weather events along the migration corridor all represent climate-related pressures that compound the milkweed loss and habitat degradation pressures. The monarch butterfly was listed as endangered on the IUCN Red List in 2022, and as a candidate for listing under the U.S. Endangered Species Act, which would provide additional regulatory protections for its habitat in the United States. Now let's talk about the supergeneration's physiology in more specific detail, because the physiological difference between a summer monarch that lives 2 to 4 weeks and a migratory monarch that lives 8 months in the same body plan. The physiology underlying this 8-month lifespan is genuinely remarkable biology. The trigger for diapause appears to be a combination of environmental cues. Shortening day length as summer progresses is the primary trigger, decreasing temperatures and the quality of available milkweed as the season changes. All contribute to the hormonal transition that keeps migratory monarchs in reproductive suspension. Researchers have identified the juvenile hormone signaling pathway as central to this diapause transition. Juvenile hormone promotes reproductive development in summer monarchs. In migratory monarchs, the juvenile hormone titers remain low, suppressing reproductive organ development and redirecting resources toward fat accumulation and survival. A migratory monarch accumulates lipid reserves across its body, including in a specialized fat body structure that provides energy for the long flight south and for the overwintering period when no nectar sources are available in the Mexican mountain forest. The lipid accumulation that occurs before migration departure is absolutely critical to winter survival. Monarchs that arrive at the overwintering site with insufficient fat reserves may not survive the overwintering period even when the forest conditions are otherwise favorable, and the quality of milkweed available during the pre-migration feeding period directly affects how much fat the butterflies can accumulate before departure. This creates a direct connection between milkweed availability in the fall breeding range and ultimately on overwintering survival rates in the Mexican mountain forest. Even butterflies that successfully complete the migration can fail to survive the winter. If the food available to their caterpillar stage was insufficient quality or quantity, the physiology that allows the migratory generation to live 8 months. Then this physiological state reverses in spring when conditions at the overwintering site change. As day length increases and temperatures rise at the overwintering site, juvenile hormone levels increase in the overwintering monarchs. Reproductive organs begin developing as juvenile hormone levels rise in response. The butterflies begin mating for the first time in their long lives, and the butterflies begin flying north toward the first spring milkweed plants emerging in the south, where the first new milkweed growth of spring is already emerging from the ground. This diapause reversal is sensitive to both temperature increase and lengthening day duration, and climate change that alters the temperature and light patterns in the overwintering forest could disrupt the precise timing of this spring departure relative to milkweed availability, creating a potential mismatch between when monarchs depart and when milkweed is available along the northward migration corridor as the spring season advances. Now let's talk about what the monarch migration actually looks like when you are standing in its path, because the population numbers and the biology can obscure what this phenomenon is at the experiential level. Along the Central Texas Migration Corridor in October in a good migration year, observers can see thousands of monarchs passing a single point in a single day. In good migration years, the butterflies can be so numerous that observers describe them as covering the sky. Every south-facing slope and windbreak becomes a temporary roost site as monarchs stop to conserve energy. Trees that monarchs use as overnight roosts can be covered in layers of resting butterflies. The orange coloration creating a visual effect that observers consistently describe as unlike anything else in their experience. This is not a historical phenomenon that has ended. It is still happening every fall. The migration still occurs each fall along the same general corridors. The same rivers of orange moving southwest through Texas toward the Rio Grande. The same overnight roosts on the same trees along the same routes, reduced significantly from historical numbers, but still present and still moving every fall. And every butterfly in that movement is a member of the single generation that carries the entire migratory journey to completion before dying in Mexico. None of the individual butterflies in that stream will return to those specific roost trees. The butterflies continuing north in spring will be their offspring, and their offspring, and their offspring's offspring working northward over multiple generations, completing the multi-generational cycle that has continued for longer than humans have been watching it. Write in the comments if you have ever seen a monarch butterfly in real life, because for much of North America, this is one of the most familiar wild insects, and it is also one of the most biologically extraordinary animals on the continent, carrying inside that half-gram of orange and black wing and body, a navigation system, 3 behavioral states, and the encoded memory of a journey that no individual butterfly alive today has ever made before. There is a specific aspect of the monarch's biology that gets less attention than the migration, but that is equally extraordinary when you examine it closely. The metamorphosis that converts a caterpillar into a butterfly is one of the most complete biological transformations known. Inside the chrysalis, the monarch caterpillar does not simply rearrange its existing structures. The larval body largely dissolves into a biological raw material. Most of the larval tissue breaks down into what biologists describe as a kind of cellular soup, a collection of undifferentiated cells and stored nutrients from the caterpillar's feeding, from which the adult butterfly's body is assembled almost entirely from scratch. The wings, the compound eyes, the long proboscis, the antennae with their navigation capabilities. None of these structures existed in any recognizable form in the caterpillar. They are assembled during the pupal stage from the raw biological material that the caterpillar spent its entire larval life accumulating on milkweed. This process takes approximately 8 to 15 days depending on temperature, and at the end of it, a completely different body plan emerges from the same case that held the caterpillar. The question of what continuity of identity means across this transformation is genuinely interesting. The neurons that will process navigation information in the adult butterfly are not the same neurons that processed sensory information in the caterpillar. Some researchers have investigated whether any learning from the caterpillar stage can sometimes be detected in the adult butterfly's subsequent behavior. The results are mixed, but there is some evidence that certain conditioned associations from the caterpillar stage persist into the adult despite the dramatic reorganization of the nervous system. This suggests some form of information transfer across the metamorphic barrier, though the specific mechanism of this information transfer is not yet understood. Now let's talk about one specific detail of the monarch's behavior during migration that is well documented in research but rarely discussed in popular coverage of monarchs. Monarchs do not fly at night. They are strictly daytime migrants. They rest overnight in trees and resume flight only after sunrise each morning. They fly during daylight hours using the sun compass we discussed, and they roost overnight in trees and shrubs along the migration corridor. This diurnal pattern has direct practical consequences for the migration timeline and duration. A monarch flying in ideal conditions covers approximately 80 to 160 kilometers per day. But days with strong headwinds, unfavorable temperatures, or heavy cloud cover may result in the butterfly staying grounded entirely and not flying at all that day. The migration therefore takes variable time depending on weather conditions along the corridor, generally between 1 and 2 months from the northern breeding range to Mexico. Monarchs fly most strongly on clear days with tailwinds from the north or northwest, which happen to be the prevailing wind conditions following cold fronts in the fall. This means that cold fronts, which mark the arrival of colder air masses from the north, actually facilitate the monarch migration by providing tailwinds. Monarchs are frequently observed in large numbers immediately following cold front passages, when northwest tailwinds allow them to cover ground much more rapidly than normal. This meteorological dependency means the timing and success of the migration is partly determined by the pattern of fall weather systems across North America. In years with unusual weather patterns, the migration may be compressed or extended in time, and in years with severe storm systems directly in the migration corridor, significant mortality can occur among butterflies caught in the open during severe weather. Now let's talk about the western monarch population because it tells a distinct and in some ways even more alarming story. There is a separate monarch population in western North America that overwinters on the California coast rather than in Mexico, specifically in groves of eucalyptus pine and cypress trees along the coast of California. In specific grove sites from approximately San Luis Obispo southward to San Diego. The western monarch population was once estimated at several million individuals in overwintering aggregations. In the 1980s, butterfly researchers estimated the total western population at 4 to 5 million individuals. By 2020, the total western overwintering count had fallen to approximately 2,000 individuals. Not 2 million individuals, approximately 2,000 total butterflies counted. A decline of more than 99.9% from peak population estimates. In 2021, there was an unexpected and still not fully explained recovery. The 2021 overwintering count reached approximately 250,000 individual butterflies, which represented a meaningful and unexpected recovery from the 2020 count of 2,000, but still leaves the western population at around 5% of its historical size at best. The reasons for this decline parallel the eastern population situation: milkweed loss, urban development loss of overwintering grove habitat, pesticide exposure. But the scale of the long-term collapse is more extreme than in the eastern population, and the partial recovery of 2021 highlights how difficult these population dynamics are to predict. A population that the 2020 count suggested was approaching functional extinction showed a surprising and still unexplained rebound in the 2021 count, suggesting the population may have more resilience than the 2020 counts implied. Or alternatively, that 2020 was an anomalously bad year and 2021 a better than average year. Without enough long-term data, it is difficult to distinguish between genuine recovery and annual variation. This uncertainty about whether what we observe is a trend or noise in a trendy is one of the most challenging aspects of monitoring small and declining wildlife populations generally. Now let's address something specific about the monarch's relationship with human culture, because this butterfly has occupied a particular place in human awareness. that most insect species, however ecologically important, simply do not achieve. In Mexico, the monarch's arrival in Michoacan coincides with the Day of the Dead celebration in early November. The Day of the Dead traditions include the belief that the souls of the dead return annually to visit the living. The timing of the monarch migration's arrival in the oyamel forests of Michoacan precisely coincides with this observance year after year with remarkable consistency. And in some indigenous traditions of the region, the butterflies are understood as the returning souls of ancestors, arriving in enormous numbers at the same time each year with complete reliability. The scientific explanation that the butterflies are returning to overwintering grounds, using genetically encoded navigation from breeding grounds in the north, does not make the consistency of that timing any less visually or culturally striking. Millions of orange butterflies covering every surface of mountain fir trees, arriving in the same forests at the same time in the calendar every year, is the kind of phenomenon that asks to be interpreted as meaningful, regardless of what biological mechanism explains and produces that precise timing. In the United States, the monarch has become a symbol of the broader pollinator conservation movement. Its visibility, its beauty, and the drama of its annual migration have made it a flagship species for efforts to restore milkweed in agricultural landscapes, restore native plant corridors along documented migration routes through the Midwest, and reduce pesticide impacts on non-target insect species in farmland. Highway verges, rooftop gardens, schoolyards, and corporate campuses have all been planted with milkweed as part of this movement. Whether these efforts are sufficient to reverse the population trend is not yet established, but the monarch's role as a conservation symbol has brought attention and resources to pollinator habitat issues that benefit far more species than the monarch alone. Write in the comments if you have ever seen a monarch butterfly roosting overnight in a tree or passing through your garden or yard during the fall migration movement. Because what strikes me most, having read through all of this research, is that the navigation system, the behavior, the physiology, and the multi-generational coordination of the monarch migration are genuinely extraordinary at a biological level. And yet, this is an animal that millions of people across North America have seen regularly throughout their entire lives without thinking about it, without being aware of what that half-gram orange insect was actually doing or carrying. I want to add one more thing about the monarch that I find myself returning to. The butterfly that makes the full southward migration to Mexico in fall is the same individual butterfly that will mate in spring at the overwintering site and begin flying north toward the first spring milkweed in the southern United States, which means a single monarch butterfly experiences more distinct phases of life in 8 months than most insect species experience across their entire compressed adult lifespans. It hatches as a caterpillar eating milkweed and accumulating toxins. It dissolves itself inside a chrysalis and reassembles into an entirely different body. It emerges as an adult, navigates thousands of kilometers using sun-polarized light and magnetic field. It overwinters in a high-altitude mountain forest in Mexico for several cold months. It mates for the first time after months of reproductive suspension. And then it dies somewhere in the southern United States after flying part of the way north, leaving behind offspring that will continue northward the journey it began in Mexico. None of this happens consciously or with any awareness of the larger pattern it is part of. The monarch does not know where it is going or what the purpose of the journey is. It does not remember the previous generation or anticipate the next. It follows programs built into its physiology and genome by millions of years of selection pressure. And those programs produce one of the most precise and consistent navigational behaviors documented in any animal anywhere. The tagged butterfly in Ontario that I described at the beginning of this flew to a specific grove of trees in Mexico because its genome told it to. And its genome told it to because the monarchs whose genomes did not contain that instruction precisely enough did not survive long enough to reproduce and pass on their less precise navigation. The precision we observe today is the accumulated result of every monarch that got it right, across the entire span of time during which this migration has existed. Write in the comments if you have ever deliberately planted milkweed or native flowers, for pollinators generally, or specifically for monarch butterflies passing through. Because one of the more striking things about the monarch conservation story is how directly individual planting decisions translate into habitat along the migration corridor. A single milkweed plant in a garden is not much on the scale of the migration corridor, but the same plant in the right location at the right time in the migration corridor is exactly what a passing migratory monarch needs to find to lay a clutch of eggs on, and what the caterpillars hatching from those eggs need to survive and develop. The migration runs through backyards and roadsides and school gardens as much as it runs through wilderness. And that means it runs partly through decisions that individual people make about what to plant.